Welcome to the First Buck Podcast, where we feature stories about entrepreneurs and the people who support them. Now, let's get started with the show.
Hello, and welcome to the First Buck Podcast, brought to you by sky'sthelimit.org. We feature stories about entrepreneurs and the people who support them. Today, we're joined by Juanita Gonzalez-Uribe, an associate professor at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Her research focuses on entrepreneurship, innovation, and private equity. Her work in these areas has been published in top academic journals, including the Review of Financial Studies, the Journal of Financial Economics, and her work has won several prizes, including the Jaime Fernandez de Araoz Prize for Best Paper in Corporate Finance, the Coller Prize Award, and the Kauffman Dissertation Award. She has also won several research grants. Juanita earned a PhD in Finance and Economics from Columbia University, and a Master's in Economics and a Bachelor in Economics and Mathematics from Universidad de los Andes in Colombia. Wow. Well, we are so excited to have you here on the podcast, Juanita. We have a little tradition. How did you earn your first buck, dollar, or peso?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me in the podcast, Nick. It's very exciting to be here. How did I earn my first dollar? Okay, so, well, I think the first peso I earned was in 2000. I was basically a freshman at Universidad de los Andes, and I was friends with a guy that was tutoring high school students in mathematics. So he was a math major, I was an economics major, and he had like this side gig. And he was going to go abroad. He was doing like one of these exchange programs or something. I forget the details. And he was looking for a substitute teacher. And he said, look, you should do it. I think you would be great. You have the personality for it. Go for it. And to be honest, with the benefit of hindsight, it was an obvious thing to do because I had been, explaining to my friends.
You were already helping them with their homework.
Exactly.
Might as well make some money.
Exactly. So it's kind of like that obvious thing, but at the time, it's difficult to know, and I wasn't sure. But the second thing that happened was that my dad, who had been working kind of like in civil service jobs for his entire life, he found himself out of a job. And Universidad de los Andes is not exactly cheap. And so I had additionally, like this motivation to really find some financing for myself, like both pocket money, but possibly also just to pay education. And I ended up saying yes. And it was the right decision. I absolutely loved it. I had to tutor some Peruvian students whose families were moving to Colombia, and the math curriculum in the two countries were different. So all I had to do was to train them so that they would fit in, with the math program in their schools. And I think it was a great job, not only because it gave me my first my first peso for sure, but it also exposed me to these Peruvians that were coming to Colombia. And what was interesting about them is that their families were families that would travel constantly, right? Colombia was just one of the countries in which they had lived. And so they also exposed me to this, I guess, more cosmopolitan view of the world, and I had always wanted to live abroad, but then with them, this just became clearer. And I don't know, it sparked in me this desire to find some sort of job where I could, explore the world, see different things, and just, meet different people. So yeah, that was my first peso.
Oh, I like that story. One of the things I'm always inspired by is how almost everyone starts off as an entrepreneur. They use their skills or the resources they have around them in a small way, and then they sort of go on this journey, and it takes people in a million different directions. But I can see how, meeting these travelers that were, moving around the world and then being exposed to all these different ideas would have certainly been inspirational to go out and explore yourself. So let's talk a little bit more about what happens next. So what happens in your career? What were some of the pivotal moments that help you sort of evolve and eventually take you to the London School of Economics?
What happened next was that it's interesting because that first peso really put me in the path of where I am today. And I don't think that's true for every first job, but it was certainly for me. Because when I was teaching, just tutoring, I mean, this was simple math, I really enjoyed it. I knew I enjoyed it, but it was very satisfying to see that something that I really, really liked was something that I could earn money from. And as I was studying at university, I realized that it could also potentially be like a full-time job.
Yep.
To be very clear, back home, when I was studying at the Universidad de los Andes, at the time when I was studying, so this was, early 2000s, I don't think I knew what being a professor meant. So we had professors, of course we did, but the vast majority of them hadn't really pursued the academic path that you would see, let's say, in the US or maybe in Europe, where, people, they do a master's, they do a PhD, and then they devote themselves to research, and whatever they research, they then hopefully teach to their students. In Colombia, the education system worked very, very differently. And while there were few people that had gone through that kind of like, let's call it traditional, academic path abroad, the vast majority of the professors were not like that. And so at the moment, it wasn't clear that you could have like a full-time job just doing research and teaching what you researched on and she loved. So anyway, I think the first pivotal moment was kind of serendipitously realizing that that was something I could do. And I say serendipitously because one of these professors that had indeed gone through this academic career abroad came back to Los Andes. So this was Marcela Eslava. She was she taught me something in economics. I forget exactly which class. And she had done her PhD in Maryland. And she had gone back to Colombia and to teach at the Universidad de los Andes. And she was looking for a research assistant. I applied for this. And I could have not applied. I don't know. Anyway, and I met her. And through her, I recognized that this could be something I could do, like for a living, and that it was super exciting that it would take me abroad, which was also something I wanted to do. So my first pivotal moment was meeting her, understanding this could happen. And in Colombia, and I think this is true for many of the Latin American countries, one thing that happens is that civil servants in general are highly educated. So many of them have gone abroad and study, and then they come back to their countries. Yeah, that's something that you see all the time. And as a consequence, there are institutions. So for example, like the Central Bank of Colombia, Banco de la República, where they have like scholarship programs for people, let's say in economics or in finance, that would want to go abroad, study one of these programs, PhDs included, with the understanding that this is a scholarship if you go back home, but if you decide to stay abroad, this is more like a loan. Yeah, exactly. So my second pivotal moment was when someone, I forget exactly how this happened, but someone explained how like one path to go and study a PhD was to get engaged with the Central Bank of Colombia, start working there, apply to one of the scholarships, and I would get there. And so that's what I did. And so I learned about this early on, and I started internship at the Central Bank of Colombia, like very early on in my career, like when I was studying. I forget, I must have been like in my third year or something like this. And I stayed there. Basically, I was an intern, and then this became like a regular job. And then through that job, I applied to the scholarship. And after that, I landed in Columbia University in New York. So that was kind of like the path.
Okay, cool. So from being a math tutor to working at the central bank to catapulting to Columbia University in New York. I love this story. So let's talk a little bit about risks. We interview a lot of business leaders and entrepreneurs, and they sometimes have this sort of moment where, they have to risk some capital, or they have an idea or an initiative or something that they want to test out, and they don't know if it's going to work. And then, through a variety of circumstances, we try and tell the positive stories, but we can also talk about negative ones. But, can you talk to us about a moment in your life where you took a leap and what the return on investment was for that? Because it's not obvious to leave your home and travel abroad and reinvent yourself and leave, your social network and other things. So, maybe, in your personal experience, what was that? What was the one that made you kind of most like fearful, and then which one do you kind of feel most grateful for the courage of doing?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the moment where I really took a risk on myself and on my family was when I graduated from Columbia University. I basically got my PhD in finance and economics. And as I explained before, there were two potential paths, right? So path number one was just go back to Columbia, which was by no means a bad path. So first, it was a scholarship. Therefore, I didn't have any debt. And second, as I said, the technocrats in Colombia, so basically the people that advise the government, all the politicians are highly educated. So I could potentially aspire to get like a very interesting job within the government where I could apply all the things I had found at Columbia, like I had learned at Columbia University. So that was path number one. Path number two, instead, was to say, you know what? Let's just make this scholarship alone and let me stay abroad.
Create a whole bunch of debt.
Exactly. There's a whole bunch of debt, and let's start with that, clean slate. And when I graduated from Columbia, I went to the job market, the academic job market, and it's a highly organized process, as you would expect from like econ and finance PhDs. And I had a number of offers after this process. One of them was in London. That was the LSE one. And I had some options in the US. So that was like path number two. There was some variation in path number two of what I could do. And what we decided to do with my husband, with Daniel, was let's go for the second option. And beyond that, let's not stay in the US, which is closer to Colombia. Let's just go across the ocean and let's go all the way to London. And at the time, I mean, again, with the benefit of hindsight, perhaps it seems like, yeah, exactly, that was the path to take for many reasons. But when we were making that decision, it wasn't obvious at all. And when you think about risk, so what was the risk here? So, of course, we had this debt. So that's an important kind of like thing. But in addition to that, in terms of risk, it wasn't clear we would necessarily be successful. And the reason for that is the academic career, after you go through the job market, if all goes well, you get an offer from a university, as I did from the LSE. But then the job that you get is not a permanent job by any means. You have to prove yourself to the department, the university, and if that happens, and there's a timeline, like a limit for this to happen, you get tenure, which is basically a permanent position you can get to stay in the university. But if you don't get that, you have to move. You cannot stay in the university. You have to find a new job elsewhere. And the probability of actually getting tenure in any single university is quite low. So when I was looking at the LSE at the finance department, the probability was very, very low. They hadn't put up for tenure anyone like in the past 3 or 4 years. So it was highly risky. But anyway, we decided to go for it because it was an adventure. I wanted to experience the life of an academic with, in its fullest expression. And London is a great place where we thought Daniel will be able to get a job. And anyway, let's just risk it. So that to me is the moment in my life.
Cool. Well, I think everyone at LSE is grateful that you took that leap of faith across the pond. LSE is a convening force in the academic world. Nobel laureates, prime ministers, George Soros, famous LSE graduate. So, what kind of advice are you giving students today in your classes that come to you with questions about how to start navigating the entrepreneurial world or finding their first job? I mean, it's changed a lot in the last 10 years and certainly in your time as a professor. So talk to us a little bit about some of the concerns they have and how you help encourage them to think through this challenge, for this new world.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're absolutely it's absolutely true. I completely agree with you that the landscape of job searching, let's put it that way, it's very different from when I began. It's also a very different place, right? I mean, when I talk about my own experience, it's a smaller country. It's a relatively poor country, so not that many people were in the university studying what I was studying at the time. So it was like a very small subset of circumstances, all of which, pointed me in my direction. When you think about the average LSE student, this is completely different, right? They're in London, this is Europe. It's like, the center of the world in many ways. So competition it's insane.
Yeah.
And also I think that now one needs to appreciate the importance of the online tools that were not available when I was starting, right? So everyone now, you network through LinkedIn. LinkedIn is a very important tool. And just having like a social profile or a profile in LinkedIn itself, it's something that people are expecting. They want to see you doing this. And as a consequence, it's just like a very different journey, but from the one I took. But in terms of the advice that I give my students, I think there's two important things. So the first thing is, I think it's super important to find a mentor earlier in the career. And you have to do this early rather than later. And the moment when you start looking for this, you'll probably feel like you're not ready or prepared or don't have much to offer to this mentor as a way of like, interesting conversation or something, in return, because you're going to be young, inexperienced, etc. But that's exactly why you should be looking for a mentor, because mentors help you understand what are the potential, paths going forward. They can introduce you to different, options that you may not have heard of. So, in some sense, my mentor in my story was Marcela, my professor. She told me about this opportunity in Colombia, right? So that works now as it worked in my case. And I think also the other thing that mentors have is that because they have more experience, they're typically older, they also have like a different perception from what the individual in specific circumstances would have, right? So as a student or as any person, you could only see thus far, whereas a mentor can take one step back and look at the bigger picture. And I think that's very important. To that, I would say, look for a mentor. Of course, the question is, where do I find one of these people?
Yeah, I was just about to say, what advice would you give to someone around how to begin this sort of search, or how to even approach someone? There's probably it can be a bit intimidating, I suppose.
Absolutely. I mean, I would say that nowadays there are places where, or like organizations or intermediaries that can help bridge the gap between people looking for mentors and people that are looking for people to mentee in some way. And one of these institutions that I recommend my students to go to all the time is, for example, an accelerator within your university. So at the LSE, we have the LSE Generate. It's, as they like to call it, is the entrepreneurial, the hub for anything entrepreneurial within the university. And what's nice about these types of institutions or organizations is that they run multiple programs where they invite both students, budding entrepreneurs, but they also invite people that want to mentor these founders, because either they have a business at present, or they just recently exited a business and they want to contribute to, give back to the community in some way. They also invite investors who are looking for potential deal flow. They have entrepreneurs in residence. The point being, there is an ability for students to find people that are not necessarily very different from them, but are much more experienced, a bit older. And I think that's also super important. A mentor, I don't think everyone would succeed from having, Obama as a mentor. Everyone would love Obama as a mentor. But you would not necessarily succeed because you may not see yourself identified or reflected in that person. And I think that a mentor should be also someone that you feel like kind of represents who you could potentially become, given a bit more time and given a bit more experience. And so it is, as you said, it's a matching process. It is a little bit of dating to find exactly that chemistry. But going to places like, let's say the local, accelerator in your university, that's something that's a place where you can find these things.
One of the things we concentrate a lot on at skyslimit.org is this transfer, what we broadly call a social capital, which lives in this professional class, these entrepreneurs, these role models that serve in institutions, in academia, in the business world, and we try and match those role models with entrepreneurs early on in their journeys. And it's so cool to hear the story of you and Marcella. It's such a common one where you find a sponsor that plays a part-time role as a therapist, as a friend, as a coach and advisor, but ultimately as someone that you can trust, that you look up to, that that doesn't actually tell you what to do, that just helps you see the blind spots in your thinking and encourages you, to keep exploring, really. And so, one of the key themes we have in this podcast that we find with so many respected leaders is just that they never do it alone. And we don't always like to talk about it, but we get so much help along the way. And mentors are so critical. And I think for young adults, as they begin to navigate all of the intimidating choices in their lives, it's really obvious that can be such an important component in their journey. So thank you for sharing that story. Let's talk a little bit about your research. You've been published in so many leading journals and have been recognized for so much of your work. I could probably spend hours digging into some of this, so I'll try and keep it at a summary level. But what have been some of the things that are most surprising, maybe, or insights that you've learned that were counterintuitive about entrepreneurship in general or the innovation process? What are some things that you'd like to convey maybe to young entrepreneurs out there listening to this podcast that they could take home and think about?
Sure. I mean, I think a big part of my research is looking at the potential constraints that entrepreneurs can face when they're trying to start, to build, or even terminate a business, right, in that process. And I think there's a lot of emphasis on financial constraints, and I certainly believe that those potentially exist, so I think they're out there. But I've tried to focus on a different type of constraint, which I call capability constraints. And if you think about the capabilities, what I mean by that is kind of like non-monetary resources that founders still need to take an idea to and build it into a really successful business. And the capabilities that I'm thinking about, just to give you a couple of examples, when you think about a high growth company or like a company that has potential for high growth, would be something like understanding that growing a business is kind of like a series of experiments. Yeah. And as a consequence, you have to learn how to design that experiment, raise financing from the best potential investor you can get for that particular experiment, and learn from the experiment as much as you can. So then in the next experiment, not only do you have better information about your business, and therefore you can steer your business in the path that it has to go, but also you're increasing the valuation of your business along the way. And that's one very broad type of capability. And I think what my research has shown is that, perhaps not surprisingly, lots of people don't have these capabilities. And I think the reason why they don't have it, partially, is because this is not something we typically teach at a university. We don't typically teach at a school. So things have been changing over time, and now everyone's talking about entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship training and all this stuff. But what I think happens, and it's a fundamental belief I have, is that lots of these capabilities you have to learn by doing. So even if we created a curriculum that was all about this, you just have to go through the experience. You have to go through the experience to really internalize these things. And so a big part of my research is looking at this, what I call capability constraints, and the ways in which entrepreneurs can potentially, kind of like mitigate those constraints, right? That build capabilities.
Let's talk a bit about it. So one of the things that I think is true in sports, for example, like I'm probably not going to be like the world's best figure skater, but if I go and practice every single day for a year, I will improve from where I am today. So in terms of the advice or the research that you've done that talks about how to increase your capabilities so that you can deal with the real world, talk to us about what that looks like. How can people practice this?
So one of my most recent papers looks at the potential role that going through venture capital due diligence can have on capability building. So when we think about venture capital investors, we tend to think of them as having this important impact on the economy because they provide financing to, innovative companies that otherwise wouldn't. And they also add a ton of value, right? So they add advice, strategic thinking, make the boards better, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is like a very rosy picture of what they do, but I believe
the 1% of businesses they go through.
Exactly. But anyway, I do believe that there's some truth there. But the other thing that VCs do, and I don't think we give them enough credit for this, and this is probably not only VCs, right? It's just like investors in general. So angels would be a big part of this equation. It's just that the setting that I could potentially study was a seed venture capital investor. One of the things they do all the time is they engage with lots of entrepreneurs as they are looking for their next potential investment. And that the way that they engage with them, which, I would describe as kind of like their due diligence process in some sense, right? They're just screening people, involves lots of interactions with entrepreneurs, right? So entrepreneurs have to pitch to them. They're, VCs are going to ask tough questions. Entrepreneurs are expected to provide some sort of answer. If things continue to go well, then you're going to have more to share. So, you give access to your data room. The VCs will test the technology. Anyway, the whole time there's this difficult conversations often that are happening. And I think that going through that process with individuals that have a lot of experience, after all, entrepreneurs have typically one business, whereas VCs see tons of business in a given day, month, or week. So being able to get all these difficult questions and all this pushback from someone that has this perspective and experience can help entrepreneurs build their capabilities. And so that's something that we show in our paper. We use data from a seed fund in the UK. And I think the main finding here really is that even if entrepreneurs don't get funding, right, from this seed fund that is conducting due diligence, you do see an increase in the business performance of, the businesses that go through this process. And I fundamentally believe that the main channel that is happening here is it's capability building. And capability building will include both, I'm learning how to do things better, right? Either because the process of doing it, there's like some learning by doing process, or perhaps the VC tells me something I hadn't thought of. So there's like an information channel there as well. But there's also another important thing, which is that VCs can also make introductions. They can tell you about another company that they had no idea existed. It could be a client, could be a supplier, could be a competitor you have to keep an eye on. So there's this idea that, there's some information going that is being, given from the VC to the entrepreneur, but also some other potential resources that are also difficult to get, like, connections, et cetera. And so, yeah, that's one of my most recent papers. And
super interesting, and real world data backs this up, which is great. We ran a survey at skieslimit.org, asking entrepreneurs what had prohibited them from pursuing entrepreneurship in the past. And there were sort of two answers that map very neatly to your own research here, which was our entrepreneurs from a 60,000 community-sized cohort respond with the reason why they wouldn't or hadn't pursued entrepreneurship before as a lack of role models, speaking directly to the importance of mentors and people that you can aspire or see yourself looking like someday. And the second was a lack of know-how, which speaks a lot to the type of capacity building that can happen when you go through, actually trying to build a business, or then having your business potentially meaningfully interrogated by an investor in a due diligence process. And I think that second one, boils down to this theme we hear a lot from entrepreneurs, is that they think they need money, right away. They're an entrepreneur. They see these eye-popping, eye-watering valuations and fundraisings. And so I wanted to ask you this question, and maybe you could share a little bit about what your research or what your perspectives studying this has been. But, what advice would you give to a young person who's thinking about their startup and they think they need a loan to get money to get started, but is that actually true? And how should they be thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, I that's a great question. I completely agree with you in the sense that you see entrepreneurs thinking the first thing I need is a bunch of money, right? I mean, that's like step 0. Then we can think about what the actual business is or whatever it is. And I think my answer is, absolutely not. So, no. The first thing that I think has to happen is, as I said, so I see entrepreneurship or any entrepreneurship endeavor, let's say, as a series of experiments. Because that's really what you're trying to do. You're trying to figure out whether this initial, very raw idea that you've come up with can get any traction. And so I would say that the first thing, like step zero, is really understanding your idea and getting information about, is this something you can actually create a product of? And is this a product that people would want to buy? And if so, how big a market is that? Like, how many people would want to buy? And based on the solutions or the answers to all those questions, is this a big enough market for you? And if the answer to all of that is yes, then you have to ask, is it a big enough market for what type of investor, right? And what type of funding I'm going to need? So I would say, first thing, like broadly speaking, is just getting more information about this very raw idea you've come up with. And I think that journey of learning more about your idea and the first series of experiments you've run, you don't necessarily need a lot of money. You don't. You need to engage with what would be your potential client. And you need to set up, like a small experiment to see whether that product you've imagined is something that they would be willing to buy. And if so, how much are they willing to pay as well? And so all those kind of like first steps, I think it's about getting information. You don't need necessarily funding. Now, of course, that depends on the specific product and it depends on the specific, idea that you have in mind. There are some that just to get started, you need some money just because they're very capital intensive. So this is not to say that no one should raise money from the very beginning. There is variations to this. But more often than not, entrepreneurs, that are young, they're inexperienced, often some of these ideas are things that you can iterate and really try to understand much better without raising much financing. And by the way, I would say that another way in which an entrepreneur can learn more about the idea and don't raise financing just yet is sell services along the way. So for example, if you want to learn more about your potential clients, how about you become like a small consultant for those clients to try to understand them better as you try to build your product, etc. And I had a guest speaker in my entrepreneurial finance class last term, Joel Perlman. He is the co-founder of Oak North, a fintech unicorn in the UK. And he spoke very much about how at the beginning of, the journey of that company, what they were was basically consultants, because that was a way in which they would get some money that they can then use to bootstrap the actual business they were interested in. So I think being creative about how you spend your time while you're acquiring this information, and potentially think about consultancy as a way to acquire information, right? And also get some money to live and like eat while you're building your business.
I love that. It's almost like you're teaching us about your own life experiences and how, you become a tutor and then you become a teacher and then become a professor and a world-leading researcher. And I think there's so much wisdom in that from use the resources around you to begin the process of practicing business. Of course, if you want to build a next generation nuclear reactor, it's going to take a lot of time and a lot of expertise and a lot of money someday. But before you can just go do that, you're going to have to learn about all kinds of other things. And you can start practicing electrical engineering. You can build capacity for yourself. Then you go on and get the necessary credentialing and, get the storytelling right and, get the political movement behind this type of thing. So it just takes forever to build that type of business. But I can assure you that anyone that wants to build rocket ships started off, doing something much simpler. And the capacity building happens over time. And so I think there's a lot of wisdom in this thinking about business as I wrote down something I liked. You have to become a business scientist and be a crazy experimenter and keep trying again and again and again. So
absolutely. I do believe that there's a lot that entrepreneurs can learn from the academic process, which is, you have to set up a hypothesis, you have to create a test to figure out whether your hypothesis is correct. And then you basically learn from that test, and you may set up or not a new hypothesis based on your findings. And that's exactly what entrepreneurs should be doing as they're building their business.
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about, how teams get formed. And I don't know if this has been a specific topic of your research, but I'd still value your perspective on it either way. No one achieves, much without the help and support and cooperation of many others. And so can you talk a bit about what you've learned either in your research or just from your own perspectives in how to build a successful team?
Yes. So I do have a couple of things to say about that. So I was saying I run an entrepreneurial finance class every spring at the LSE. And as part of that class, what students have to do is create a team, come up with a business idea, build a simple but still business plan, and then pitch it at the end. And we have this competition. So that's the idea behind the class. Along the way, they're learning about entrepreneurial finance, but that's the big exercise they have to do. And so I've learned by teaching what happens at the team creation phase of this, which I don't assign them teams. This is important. I allow them to pick whoever they want to. They can form. They're free to form their team. And second important thing to say about my class, so that you understand what I'm going to say, it's open to anyone who's doing a master's at the LSE. It doesn't have to be in finance or in economics. So I have a wide range of people that are coming to the class. And what I observe every year is that team formation is not efficient, in the sense that what people tend to do, and this is a very natural thing to do, let me be clear, this is natural, is they tend to form teams if we're all studying masters in finance, chances are we're going to build a team, right? So everyone is a master of finance at the team. And they also typically tend to choose people that look like themselves, in the sense that they've come from the same country, even sometimes the same city, meaning they're going to have exactly the same networks to tap into. And when I look at this, I just don't understand it. To the extent that when I look at the teams over time that have been the most successful, are those that, instead of looking for someone that looks exactly like you and has to offer exactly the same thing to the team, you look for a complement. Someone that has something you don't have, and that as a consequence can really add to the equation, so that when we bring these two people together, we actually add up to more of, to more than the sum of our parts, basically. Yeah. And so I think that a big message from me, from this experience of just seeing my students go through my class, is when you're thinking about a team, it's natural and more comfortable to work with people that talk your same language, both, language, per se, but also just like, your experience language, your skill set language, etc. But what you really have to do instead is think about, how do we build the best business possible, and what are the different parts that we have to have? And whatever thing you cannot satisfy, because we're not jack of all trades. We all have our own specialty. So you have to look for that other part who complements what you have. And I don't think people do this enough.
It's funny because it's a bias that everyone has. They're afraid to sometimes approach others or include others or let their perspectives be vulnerable to someone else's lived experience or something. But if you think about it quite rationally, like, building a business is like building a ship or a house or a tool. And if you only have carpenters and you're trying to build a boat, you're never going to get all the components you need in order to put it out to sea. And you need a diversity of skills and experiences to do so. And so, intellectually, we can get there and understand that, but we start off from this place of tribalism and concern and fear around how to do all this stuff. So anyway, it's often those are the painful lessons that you could read about it in a research paper, you could hear about it from an old mentor, and sometimes you have to make the mistake to watch how a diverse group of people can overcome adversity far more quickly than a team of people that all look and sound and think the same way. So exactly. Great insight. Thank you so much for sharing that. So I noticed you've got quite the collection of books. I'm not surprised behind you. Quick, off the top of your head, what's kind of the best book you've read this year that's, inspired some new thinking for you? we're always looking for book recommendations on a podcast.
So I mean, I absolutely love Margaret Atwood. I don't understand why she hasn't won the Nobel Prize yet. I'm just like, I'm still waiting. What's happening? Everyone's waiting. I don't know. It's ridiculous. And I recently read Hackseed, which I hadn't read, and I absolutely loved. And it's basically what she does in this book is she takes like a well-known play by Shakespeare, and it's part of like a bigger collection, as I understand it, of that like that effort. So they basically had multiple authors taking different plays from Shakespeare and trying to rewrite them as they wished. And so she takes basically The Tempest and rewrites it in the context of a prison. And there's basically the main protagonist is basically trying to get the inmates to be part of the production, and it's incredibly funny, and it's also so very thoughtful. It's very much like who she is. It's very surprising and funny and just very insightful of the human experience. And so I absolutely loved it, and I highly recommend it.
Need to revisit some of the classics in a contemporary format, so maybe that's something I need to go invest in. Thank you for sharing those suggestions. Okay, one last question here. Taking the steps to pursue entrepreneurship or to take any risk in your life can feel really scary. What tips can you give our listeners for how to manage some of the stress that might come with making or evaluating those risks and maybe choosing to run your own business or become an entrepreneur?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. As mental health issues have become more of a forefront, right? Now we think more about these things. There are more tools that are available to people, both non-entrepreneurs, but also entrepreneurs, of course. But that it's often difficult to forget that the stories that we hear about entrepreneurship most of the times are the very successful ones. And in fact, for every successful story, there's a ton of failure. And that's part of what the process is. And we shouldn't be afraid of failure. We should embrace it. And all of this is fantastic. But that's not to say that the people that go through that failure don't suffer. And so I think it's very, very important to, have, I would say 2 things. A person or a group of people that is something like the safe space of an entrepreneur, someone that you can talk to, and just honestly discuss what's going on in the business, but also particularly how that makes you feel. And I think that's important, having this safe space, because as an entrepreneur, you often will have to wear this mask of everything's good and we're going to make it and nothing's happening here. And so you do have to have this ability to really be yourself, let go of this mask and acknowledge the feelings so that they don't build out, but then you kind of like explode. So I think that's important. And the second thing that I think entrepreneurs can do, and I think it can be useful, is just really setting aside some time during the day, during the week, to reflect, meditate on things that are not just the business. Because I think there's also this notion of losing perspective and the business becoming your entire life. And you cannot forget that you have your families and your hobbies and whatever makes you kind of like a fully fledged human. And so keeping track of that, what stuff is outside of the business, I think it's super important. Set aside a time of day to do something else beyond your business that it makes you happy and reminds you of your humanity. So I think that's important.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I think those are great pearls of wisdom. The path to success for everyone has ups and downs. And I think, one of the things that I really hope to reiterate to the community listening is that capability building comes with sort of a mindset too, which is failure is going to happen. So anticipate it, treat it as a learning opportunity. If it becomes extraordinarily stressful, you need to go find a bench, a tribe, a safe space where you can talk about how that is affecting you and the feelings you have for it. But use that to build resiliency and go test your idea again, learning from the mistake. And if you can develop a way of doing that and persevering, you can improve your product, your business idea, your storytelling, and over time, the practice of doing that, just like a scientist getting through a thesis, has to try many different things before they get the outcome they hope for. You get there in the long run. And so I think finding other people that are going through the same thing as you is a great place to start. There are so many communities for entrepreneurs to meet with other entrepreneurs, other founders. And that lived experience is one that's very hard for them to sometimes share, even with family members or others. And so find some people that you can really be honest with to support you through that is great advice. So anyway, we've been so grateful to have your precious time today, Juanita. Thank you for coming on the podcast. So at skieslimit.org, we connect underrepresented entrepreneurs with volunteer business professionals for free one-on-one mentoring. We also provide business guides to all of our members, plus monthly funding opportunities. So you can sign up for free today. And if you liked what you heard, please subscribe and share. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the First Buck podcast. Don't forget to join the community of underrepresented entrepreneurs and their supporters by signing up at skiesthelimit.org. Click subscribe, and we'll see you next time.